Mr. Rance, if you wouldn't mind turning on your video.
Good morning to everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. I see, thank you. I would like to welcome everyone to today's panel on expanding LGBTQI plus legal rights. To begin, I'd like to welcome U.S. Consul General to Mumbai, David J. Rands, for opening remarks.
Thanks, Cody. Good evening, and thank you for joining our program, Beyond the Binary, Expanding Legal Rights of the LGBTQI plus community. The United States promotes the protection of human rights and the promotion of democratic values around the world. We believe that, at the most basic level, advancing human rights is the best way to achieve the shared goal of peace and prosperity that we all want for ourselves and for our communities. In keeping with that vision, my team and I have organized a series of monthly dialogues to promote the human rights of the queer community in Western India. These discussions have encouraged awareness and understanding of the range of challenges and concerns that LGBTQI plus persons and their allies face every day, including identity, intersectionality, discrimination and bias, workplace inclusion, parenting, and so much more. At their heart, democratic societies recognize that each individual is unique, contributes value to society, and deserves an equal right to pursue their happiness. Unfortunately, across the world, the LGBTQI plus community is often denied that right. In many countries, these citizens face discrimination in nearly every aspect of their lives, be it in education, workforce participation, or access to healthcare and housing. Often, these discriminatory practices are upheld through laws that criminalize private, consensual same-sex relationships and marriage. In some countries, LGBTQI plus individuals are persecuted. According to a 2020 report by the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association, 70 countries criminalize same-sex relationships. The death penalty for same-sex relationships is either allowed or evidence of a practice exists in 11 of these countries. In more than half the world, LGBTQI plus people benefit from no protection against workplace discrimination, and most governments deny trans people the right to legally change their name and gender from those that were assigned at birth. The ILGA study indicates that 1/4 of the world's population believes that being LGBTQI plus should be a crime. Despite these grim statistics, we are today seeing a rising global trend toward decriminalizing same-sex relations and providing legal rights for this community. In 2/3 of UN member states, 124 countries, consensual sexual acts between same-sex adults are legal. 28 countries now recognize same-sex marriages, and 34 others provide for some recognition of partnership for same-sex couples. As of December 2020, 81 countries had laws on the books against discrimination in the workplace based on sexual orientation, compared to only 15 countries 20 years ago. Until 1962, all 50 states in the US criminalized same-sex sexual activity. But by 2003, all laws against homosexual activity were finally declared unconstitutional. Massachusetts became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage following a ruling by the state's highest court in 2003. In 2015, the US Supreme Court ruled all state bans on same-sex marriage unconstitutional, allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry nationwide. In 21 states and the District of Columbia, state law protects people from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in employment, housing, and public accommodations. The US government is working to promote queer inclusion at home. President Biden committed to being a champion for LGBTQI plus people every day in the White House, and that commitment has been met with action. To cite just two examples, in June 2021, the U.S. Department of Education issued a notice of interpretation that Title IX, an existing law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in education, also prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Also in June, the White House announced that the U.S. Department of State would begin the process of including a non-binary gender marker and modernizing existing requirements for updating gender markers on United States passports, a policy that affects millions of individuals in the U.S., including an estimated 1.2 million non-binary adults, 2 million transgender people, and as many as 5.5 million people who were born intersex. In October 2021, just a few weeks ago, the U.S. issued the first U.S. passport with an X gender marker. There is a lot of work left to create societies that fully live up to the ideals of democracy. Achieving inclusion requires all of us to play a part, and it starts with understanding the challenges that LGBTQI+ people face, which is why we are here today. I am thankful to all the speakers for joining this Beyond the Binary discussion. Today we have three eminent speakers, Judge Victoria Kolakowski, Cristobal Alvear, and Vijay Hiramath, who will share expertise and personal experiences in supporting LGBTQI+ legal rights in society. Finally, I want to thank my colleague Cody Etlin for volunteering to bring his incredible talent in as today's moderator. Thank you, and over to you, Cody.
Thank you very much, Consul General David Rands. I welcome our international audience tuning in from different corners of the world. Welcome, bienvenidos, and namaskar. An especially warm welcome to our impressive and distinguished panelists. With us today, we have Judge Victoria Kolakowski, who became the first openly transgender trial court judge of general jurisdiction in the United States when she was elected in Alameda County, California in 2010. She has spoken widely internationally on LGBTQI+ issues and is passionate about ensuring access to justice. She is also the former president of the International Association of LGBTQI+ Judges. Next, we have Cristobal Alvear, a Spanish legal researcher and advisor on comparative constitutionalism and LGBTQI+ rights, specializing in Asian legal systems. He is an adjunct professor at IE Law School and an associate expert at Casa Asia. Among other accomplishments, Cristobal is a founding member of Exterior es Diverso, the LGBTQI+ association of the Spanish Foreign Service. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Vijay Hiramath, a lawyer and an activist from Mumbai with more than 20 years of working experience in the field of human rights. An expert on India's criminal justice system, Vijay has regularly represented LGBTQI+ persons in court. He has worked with the India Center for Human Rights and Law and the Lawyers Collective. Welcome to everyone. For introductory remarks, we'll start with Judge Kolakowski. Thank you.
Okay. I'm unmuted now, right? Okay, great. Good evening to you. For me, I'm in Alameda County, California, which I'm in the city of Oakland, which is across from San Francisco, in case people want to get an idea of physically where I'm located. And that's, 13 hours earlier than you. So for me, it's good morning. But for all of you, it's good evening. And I'm very, very honored to be here with you today. I have a number of things that I'm going to be able to be talking with us about today regarding LGBT rights in the United States. I've been working on these issues and studying them with regard to from both the local, state, and national level for over 3 decades. And but one of the things I can say, I do have to say though, is that as a judge who's presently sitting as a judge, There are certain things that I'm not going to be able to opine about. I can't discuss any pending cases or controversies, and whatever I say is my own opinion as a person who teaches and speaks about these issues. And so I just want to be clear to the audience about that. But with that in mind, what I'm going to be talking about, I think today, fall into two categories. One is the current state of LGBT rights in the United States. Relate the cutting edge issues at this point are the intersection between our privacy protected rights, like for LGBT people, and religious freedom, which in the United States is an extremely important and valued position. And those sometimes come into conflict. I taught a class about that this summer, and I'll probably be talking more about that later. And at this point in the United States, transgender rights have become a very, very controversial topic on a state and local level. And I can talk about that as well as I will talk about some of the best practices that I've seen with regard to trying to expand rights.
Thank you very much, Judge. Over to Cristobal.
Good evening, everyone. Good night from Malaysia, where I am now. Thanks, Cody, for your kind introduction, and thank you to the Consul General for his invitation to this panel. As Cody said, I do my main research and work on South Asia and Southeast Asia. However, I'm not going to talk today about Asia or India, a continent and a country that I truly love, but about the situation of LGBT rights in Spain. And Spain is not a country that could be defined as a legal pioneer in many fields. However, Spain has been the forefront of LGBT rights. And that is part now of our legal pride. But things haven't been easy for the Spanish LGBT struggle. Our legal success is quite recent. Not many years ago, the Spanish LGBT community was criminalized and marginalized. The crucial role of LGBT activists of the generation that preceded me, to whom we should be extremely grateful in Spain, changed the social and legal narrative. And I would like to use these opening remarks to quote Pedro Cerolo, the late Spanish parliamentarian and LGBT activist, who was already there when it was really hard to be an activist in Spain. And he said, answering to a politician that was against the expansion of LGBT rights, and I'm quoting him, "In your model of society, I have no place. In mine, you do have one." I repeat, in your model of society, I have no place. In mine, you do have one. And in a way, that has been and still is the motto of the Spanish LGBT battle. What we believe is that the expansion of LGBT rights does not expel anyone from the legal system, that the enforcement of LGBT rights does not break the equality and non-discrimination principles, and that the LGBT advancement is not done in detriment of any individual or social group. The LGBT model of society is based on inclusiveness, on diversity, and on dignity. And this LGBT legal struggle is not an independent effort, but part of a larger counter-majoritarian battle where minorities and minorized groups meet. And we have to achieve it together by overcoming our legal history created from majoritarian narratives, the predominant social morality, and the everlasting political resistances. And Cody, I'm willing to add some comment on this during the panel. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cristobal. Over to Vijay Hirima.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you for that introduction. And very happy to be part of this panel with Judge Victoria and Cristobal. In terms of when we speak about India and LGBT rights, India is in a very nascent stage compared to US and Spain or rest of the European countries, if you see, because homosexuality was decriminalized only in 2018. We had a short span where it was again decriminalized and criminalized between 2019 to 2013. And then now it is in 2018, recently it has been decriminalized. The issue is that sex is one part of it, this thing, but the society has to realize there are much more things to it. There is love, there is relationship, and there is a recognition and the dignity to a life of an individual who comes from sexual minority communities. And that is something which we have to achieve, and it is a long struggle, long battle we have to wage. And I'm not saying there have been no positive things after the judgment has come or decriminalization has happened. It has helped people to come out, express themselves, express their sexuality, live a life with dignity in some sort. There have been changes in terms of the government, what is doing for transgender rights. They have set up welfare boards. They are doing reservation for them in government jobs at some level. But there are also a lot of problems in terms of discrimination which still continue. And I personally believe, unless and until there is a larger anti-discrimination law in the country, this problem will not go away. Just yesterday, to give a short example, how we are going backwards, was the Parliament passed the Assistive Reproductive Techniques Act, and it has specifically excluded LGBT people from going for any of these techniques to have children. So that is a major setback, I feel, in terms of the taking away ahead the rights. And so there is provision in the Surrogacy Act. There are no provisions for adoption for LGBT couples. And yeah, so this is the scenario where I'll be talking about today in the today evening about this and the struggles ahead, how we have come here so far. And it's a hopeful situation. I don't say that it's not a hopeful situation, because though the government has stalled it, but we might have an openly gay judge in the Delhi High Court very soon. His name has been recommended a few times, but the government is sitting on it. The ultimate approval comes from the government, but we are hoping that he gets appointed. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. To kick off this panel, start with the first question. Could each of you please give us a brief overview of the recent legal history of LGBTQI+ rights and perhaps the particularities of the legal systems in your respective countries? Perhaps we can start with Judge Kolakowski.
Absolutely. And so, as I noted earlier, laws are in our system, and I think that's quite similar in India, occur at a local, a state, and a federal level. And the history of LGBT rights in the United States is often followed in that order: expansion of rights. And in the United States, for example, we heard earlier from the Consul General about the development on a broader scale, decriminalization marriage. 2 years ago in the Bostock decision, our Supreme Court said that our anti-discrimination laws protected LGBT people in employment settings, but not based upon a constitutional right, but based upon an interpretation of a statute. At this point in the United States, I think, and also there was a discussion that was given about direction about, for example, in education, the idea that sexual orientation and gender identity are supposed to be considered to be protected under our laws. The backlash has occurred on a state level, where we see states trying to impose restrictions in contrast to that sort of executive action, particularly around transgender rights. This has been a landmark year for legislation that would that's targeted specifically at transgender people, especially transgender youth, and schools and public accommodations and sport. And so that's, I think, where we are at the cutting edge. But we're also part of, I think, of a broader discussion that's going on from a judicial point of view as to the source of rights in the United States and how those play out against each other. In the United States, there's our courts have protected rights such as abortion rights, which we heard oral argument yesterday at the U.S. Supreme Court about, things relating to LGBT rights based upon a notion of a right of privacy, which is never enumerated but is assumed to exist. And this has been a source of tension between liberal and conservative legal scholars in the United States for the past half century. And how that plays out may have a great impact on a federal level as to how things are. But we have, on the other hand, individual states have some have very strong protections and very strong rights in places like California and New York. In other places, like in Texas, not so much. And so I think that the LGBT community in the United States has been focusing on trying to get things on a federal level, but we understand the difficulties of the realities of dealing with going through our particular process in our Supreme Court. It's not like we have a declaration of rights that talk about privacy or human dignity, those sorts of concepts. I think that those were assumed but never explicitly stated, and so we struggle with that. But nevertheless, I think that we do not have, for example, a national law prohibiting discrimination against LGBT people. There's been attempts to get that for the past, for decades, and it has passed one house of our legislature and it is stalled in the other. And unfortunately, as is often the case with these sort of discussions, they happen within the context of larger national and local political and other developments. And so sometimes they help drive it, and sometimes we are at the mercy of that. And so I don't know if that really answers the question adequately, but I think that we'll talk about some other things later that may help me flesh out that.
It does. It certainly does. Thank you, Judge Kolakowski. Over to Cristobal.
Thank you, Cody. Briefly about the Spanish legal system, Spain is a constitutional decentralized country with a civil law-based system. We have comprehensive legal codes, not only from the national parliament, but also from the regional parliaments. We have separation between public and private law, the primacy of written law, and a hierarchical organization of the judiciary with a system of appeal that ends at the Supreme Court. And on top of it, we have a constitutional court, but just for cases involving constitutional matters. But Spain is also part of the European Union, and therefore the Court of Justice of the European Union is the apex court regarding European Union law. And Spain is also part of the Council of Europe, and then the European Court of Human Rights interprets the European Convention on Human Rights that has been, by the way, key in the development of LGBT rights in Europe and specifically in Spain. Regarding the path of our LGBT rights history in Spain, let me share with you this timeline. Sorry about that. This is not the one. This is the one. So Spain was a dictatorship until 1977. The LGBT community that lived until then clandestinely was criminalized, persecuted, and marginalized. Spain became a constitutional democracy in 1978 that brought the decriminalization of homosexual relations. Since 1995, major achievements on equality have happened. And in 2005, Spain was the third country in the world to approve same-sex marriage, and the first one to allow adoption with equal rights for LGBT people. And in 2007, Spain allowed also transgender people to change their gender identity without gender reassignment surgery. Since then, a collection of national, regional non-discrimination laws have been enacted. Deputy prosecutors for criminal offenses on equality and non-discrimination have been created. And importantly, a bill for the full and effective equality of transgender people and for the guarantee of LGBT rights is nowadays under the consideration of the Spanish Parliament. This bill aims to promote the right to real and effective equality of LGBT people, to prevent and to eliminate all types of discrimination that affect not only the social perception of the community, but also that affects LGBT families, because now we're talking about families and their rights, and also to establish the rectification registry for the sex and names of the individuals to make the procedure speedy, more easy. Leaving the floor to you, Cody.
Thank you, Cristobal. Over to Vijay.
Well, the struggle in India has been long on the streets as well as the legal struggle in terms of first the decriminalizing homosexuality. Somewhere in the late 90s, a petition was filed in the Delhi High Court by this foundation called the Nas Foundation. And in the early 2000s, the petition was dismissed by the Delhi High Court, saying that it was an academic discussion. There was no actual petitioner who has been criminalized for homosexual acts. Hence, they were not willing to listen to the matter, and the petition was dismissed. The Supreme Court restored the matter and sent it back to the Delhi High Court for hearing. And fortunately, in 2009, there was a judgment by Justice Shah and Justice Muralidhar, which was, I feel, still a brilliant judgment. I would say better judgment than the Supreme Court gave eventually. That was in 2009. So there was a huge joy everywhere. Things were changing as we see that moment that it is decriminalized. The blackmail cases were going down. People were coming out. But suddenly in 2013, the Supreme Court overturned that decision. A lot of religious groups had appealed against that decision. The central government had not appealed against that decision. That was a very important factor. But still, the Supreme Court said that no, and also made remarks saying that gay people are a minuscule minority, and that was a big setback for the people in India. Then there were other developments that happened in between, and the privacy judgment came in 2017. There was a judgment of NALSA which came in 2014, which recognized transgender people and transgender rights and also said they should not be discriminated. But still, homosexuality was a criminal act. It was only in 2018, finally, when the Supreme Court heard a new petition as well as the review petition of the earlier judgment. They set aside the earlier Supreme Court order and have said that homosexuality is not a crime. There were a lot of observations they took from the Delhi High Court judgment, and one was the most important, I feel, which cuts across all rights, is constitutional morality is supreme, and it is more supreme than anybody else's morality, a group's morality, or individual morality. And I think that is something which will help the LGBT rights and LGBT community further advancing the rights in the country. After that, there have been few developments. As I said in the beginning, the Trans Act, Rights Act was brought in. Of course, there was a huge opposition from the transgender community itself, because in actual sense, it was not giving any rights, though it was making loud noises. But actually, if you go through the act, which doesn't give actually any acts, and some of the definitions are extremely problematic in terms of transgender people. But in a sense, there is a progress. This is how we are going, and this has been a struggle. And currently, the people are now filing petitions for marriage. There are a couple of state and the High Court, Delhi High Court, as well as the Kerala High Court, are going to hear petitions on regarding whether under the Indian law, marriage can happen between same-sex people. And just last week, the High Court has issued a notice, and strangely, I don't know what it means, but whether this particular case can be live telecast and people can hear the arguments, which doesn't happen generally in India. The cases are not broadcasted live. So I feel there is a hope. The court wants to send a message across, and maybe there is a favorable judgment coming across. Yeah.
Thank you, Vijay. There's certainly some suspense regarding that case.
Yeah.
On to the next question. In democracies like ours, what do you think is the main driver for change in social acceptance of LGBTQI+ rights? Laws or the influence of cultural norms? Should a law precede cultural norms or vice versa?
Okay, I'll jump in on this one because I do have strong feelings about this. I moderated a panel a few weeks ago for the American Bar Association on transgender understanding transgender people, and about particularly looking at the documentary Disclosure, which is about the way the transgender people are portrayed in popular media in the United States. And I think that the two are very closely connected. I believe that a law can't get too far ahead of where society is, because then no one will acknowledge and follow it. Because, but on the other hand, I think that making cultural changes helps drive the society forward, and sometimes the court play catch up, and sometimes the courts can be a little bit far ahead. I attribute some of the issues that are coming up with transgender youth with the fact that we have not seen the cultural changes necessary to make inclusion for transgender people before we went ahead and implemented broad, sweeping legal protections. And I think that this is in some ways a backlash against that. I think that it's very important that we understand that all of these things exist within a context. You can have a law, and if nobody enforces it, nobody believes in it, nobody follows it, it's meaningless. And so that's why I think that the two are closely related. And I think that it's important when we look at trying, for example, in the United States, we had all sorts of political attempts, legal attempts, and things like that. But I think in some ways the most important thing that for moving LGBT rights forward in the United States in the 1990s was Ellen DeGeneres coming out. I mean, one of the things that was successful, I think, for a lot of people in the United States was this idea of coming out, of having people get to know LGBT people, so that we aren't viewed as being this tiny minority, but instead as people that are not those other people over there, but are people who are close to us. And I think that is a big part of that changing of the cultural norms, is by people being out and visible and telling stories, and for people to see that we're not inherently different, or these others but that these are people who they know and understand and are friends with and connected with, and that's not just a fluke, but that's something that happens all the time, and that there are lots of us like that.
I will take that from there. Let me illustrate this question with also with a map that we have here. Here we can see at your left the acceptance of LGBT people in the European Union in 2019. And Spain, within the UK, the Netherlands, and Sweden, all of them were above 90% of acceptance. And at your right, I'm sorry it's not translated. It says in Spanish, if you believe that homosexuality should be accepted. And in green, you have the rates of this acceptance by the population. And Spain, along with the European Union region, is around 90% of acceptance, being the lowest acceptance rates in Africa and the Middle East. But what has happened with trans people? In Spain, there is almost 83% acceptance of trans identity rights. And at your right, you have also that 70% of Spaniards demand more support to trans people. But has this large support to the LGBT community always been there in Spain? The answer is no, of course not. I mean, I'm not talking about 1975 during our dictatorship. I'm talking about 2005, when the Same-Sex Marriage Act was approved in Spain. And at that time, just little more than half of the population was favorable to same-sex marriage, and less than half of it agreed to allow adoptions by LGBT families. Not only that, but that very year, 2005, when the Same-Sex Marriage Act was adopted in Spain, the major conservative political party of the opposition also filed a constitutional appeal against same-sex marriage, that, by the way, was rejected by the Constitutional Court years later. Nowadays, this very same political party support same-sex marriage. What I'm trying to say is that all these events that happened between 2005 and nowadays is that law triggered a change on the cultural, the social, and the political perceptions in Spain. But it's also true that all this law would not have been enacted in Spain if it wasn't for the role and work during decades of LGBT activists. And regarding the question if law should precede cultural norms, I would like to follow Vijay's consideration on constitutional morality, because I think that that question was answered in India by Dr. Ambedkar himself more than 70 years ago, when he stated that constitutional morality should prevail over social morality. And this constitutional morality has its core in the idea of inclusiveness and rests upon the recognition of diversity. But as Dr. Ambedkar also said, constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment of society. It has to be cultivated. And this is not only the role of law, but also the role of politics and society. And I will leave it there. Thank you, Cory.
Well, I, for one, would say less laws, the better. And the change should come within the community first. And the people, as Cristobal said, it is the politics and the people who are in places of power, how they drive the society, that also makes a huge difference. And unless and until that is there, no matter how many laws you are going to create, how many things you are going to criminalize, things are not going to change to a large extent. But the other way is to look at it is taking the bull by the horn. And if there are certain practices in the society which are completely abhorrent to the dignity of a human being, then you have to have laws. I'll give an example of India. Of course, it was long, long ago. The practice of sati, where a widow had to jump into the pyre of the burning pyre of the husband. And that could not be stopped. Only when there was a legislation brought, it is completely stopped. And similar example I would give is of child marriage. And still there are a lot of child marriages, in spite there is a law, but it has come down. It is now people are recognizing that it is not correct. So unless and until there is the change also within the society, but a law to support it, things are not going to change. Like to give an example in terms of LGBT community, I would say the law of adoption, marriage, or you would say partnership has to change. And until that doesn't happen, this adoption and partnership will not be accepted by society to a large extent. And that follows to the, which is automatically connected later to the property rights and to tax benefits and all these things. So until and unless you bring in these sort of laws, I don't think there will be major changes. And whatever changes in terms of society we'll see, it will be remain in the urban centric areas, which may not perpetuate to the smaller rural areas. And I think in some cases the law has to precede first.
That's an excellent segue to our next question, which is, what is the current frontier or battleground for LGBTQI plus rights in your respective countries? We can start with Cristobal to change up the order.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So let's think about Europe and Spain. And do we think that everything is already acquired for the LGBT community in terms of rights? The answer is not. And let me also share one more slide with you in this regard. In this map made by ILGA, this map shows that even the countries that are at the front foot of LGBT rights have a long legal way to go for full equality. And also it's the case of Spain. If we have still even to reach a lot of legal concerns to grant a real equality and non-discrimination to the LGBT community. And as I said before, a bill for the full and effective equality of transgender people and for the guarantee of LGBT rights is currently under the consideration of the Spanish Parliament. This bill addresses some of our main battlegrounds, such as self-determination identity. The future law recognizes the right to self-determination of gender identity. Transgender people can be recognized by the authorities without any psychological report being required. However, we should not take the advancement of LGBT rights for granted. There are many political and social forces against LGBT rights. Of course, also in Spain, where political forces remain silent for a while, but they are raising again their voices, supported by far-right movements. And to consolidate the LGBT advancement, the Spanish LGBT community cannot be in the margins of the institutions and society. We need to be an active part of them, not only creating institutions as caretakers of our communities, such as LGBT ombudsman, that by the way is missing in Spain, but as also adding LGBT values to the national narrative, including, as Judge Victoria said, in the educational curricula. And I must identify the main threat nowadays that, in my opinion, is the lack of awareness of our vulnerability. The full equality of the LGBT community cannot be reached just with a simple declaration of that equality, but with an active promotion and protection of it. As all minorized groups, LGBT persons and families face different challenges just because who they are. Let me give you an example about this. Hate crime against the LGBT community is rising in Spain. Although still small in numbers, LGBT persons are being attacked just because they are so. This is part of our vulnerability, and it cannot be addressed by standard laws and basic procedures. We need specific legal and institutional tools to protect the LGBT community against this rise of hate crimes. Thank you, Cody.
Thank you very much, Cristobal. Over to you, Vijay. What is the current frontier or battleground for LGBTQI plus rights in your country?
Well, as I mentioned before, and as we see from this thing, partnerships and marriage is going to be one of the challenges which has already been launched in the courts. But I think after that will be adoption and in terms of property rights, this thing. But what I see is that there should be a larger anti-discrimination law, which the community should be fighting for first, instead of this thing, because these things will come with the anti-discrimination law. Once the anti-discrimination law comes, there are a lot of, it paves a way for a lot of things to automatically move away from the barriers that are created in terms of partnership or marriage or adoption or property rights. But and also there is a huge movement to get the reservations for transgender people in terms of government jobs. Many states have now given, of course, it's a minuscule 1% reservation for transgender people in government jobs. But I think these are the issues which will come up more and more. But I must highlight the issues that we are facing day in and day out, especially after the pandemic and during the lockdown. There were a lot of people who came out to their parents, transgender people, gay people, and they faced a lot of abuse at home. They were young, between say 18 and 21, 22, and the access to in terms of organization or help at that time was very little. So there were a lot of cases people were tortured also because, and they were being forced into some kind of treatment. Myself had to file 2 petitions before the High Court when the High Court was not functioning fully, and get protection for these people who had come from different southern Indian states and somehow managed to come to Bombay. Now, this is not an easy task to move the High Court, get orders and all. So I can see the larger problem, how many people may not have been able to reach a lawyer or file a petition in that sense. And I think with which you will come to when we come to your next question about advocacy, all these things will be important. There was during this time only that Chennai High Court judgment came, which was a welcome judgment in terms of gay rights, where a judge himself went said that I have never come across these kind of cases or these, he said, LGBT people. And he underwent counseling, which was a welcome change. He made the parents of the girl undergo counseling. And then he passed a very good order saying that the police should not be taking action when the girls run away or the parents come with complaints to the police stations, which was a huge welcome. But I doubt how many other states are going to follow this kind of process. There needs to be I don't know everything can be covered by the judges, courts and judgments. But I think there needs to be a change where, especially where there are consenting adults running away or wanting to live on their own, the state should not interfere, the police should not interfere. I think more than partnership, this is going to be a challenge especially when there are powerful parents or they're economically stronger and who can go after the girls or the LGBT people to a large extent. I think this is going to be a challenge more and more.
Thank you, Vijay. I think the pandemic and lockdown restrictions have disproportionately affected the LGBTQI plus community among other minorities. Judge Kolakowski, what would you say is the current legal frontier for LGBTQI rights in the U.S.?
Well, I think I alluded to the fact that there really are two big areas right now. That the first is the intersection, the conflict that's occurred between protecting people's religious rights and protecting LGBT rights. This, for example, was brought before our Supreme Court, and who kind of ducked it on a technicality last year in the decision of Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, where the city had cut off a contract for providing foster care services for a contract. There was a contract that the Roman Catholic churches in Philadelphia had for many years, that was revoked because of their position about placing people in same-sex households, and the argument was that it interfered with their religious practice to require them to do otherwise, and the court kind of sidestepped that particular issue at that point. But we see this sort of thing coming up with legislation on a local level, on a statewide level, in a number of states, including it's showing up in terms of denial of medical care and things like that. Religious right to refuse to provide certain types of care based upon their own moral beliefs, and a couple of states have actually enacted such laws this past year. And then also, this was, as I said, a record-breaking year for introduction of bills aimed at transgender people, particularly transgender youth. Over 100 bills in 2/3 of the states in the United States, of which a number were adopted. Most were not, but some of them are still pending. But there are a number of states where some very broad anti-transgender measures were enacted. Some of them have been stayed by our federal courts, is going to work up their way up the system. For example, in the state of Tennessee, there was a requirement that if a business was going to allow transgender people to use the bathrooms that meet their gender identity, they needed to put a warning sign on the door. And that was stayed, but that's the sort of challenges that we're facing now, is trying to stop that kind of backlash, I think, from the progress that has been made. And so this is often the case, that when progress is made, there's backlash. There have been a number of bills introduced on a state level that would prohibit local municipalities from enacting their own protections. Again, this is, as I said, it tends to move up from local to state to national, and sometimes the backlash goes in the other direction. And so I think that those are really the key battleground kind of issues right now. And I can tell you that for my friends, and I have a number who work in the transgender rights area, they're tired. This was a very, very hard year, and these are very controversial issues. They are among the most politically sensitive in our country right now, along with race, and in terms of what goes on in the educational setting. critical race theory and transgender issues are the two hot button issues in local politics now, and in the United States. So that's kind of where I think we're at, and I don't know how that's going to play out in the long run. I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Judge Kolakowski. I think you definitely touch upon a very relevant topic, and that is that, you know, the evolution of the legal landscape surrounding LGBTQI plus rights and other minorities certainly does not follow a linear direction. Sometimes it's one step forward, two steps back. But that does bring us to our final question, which is looking forward. What legal advocacy strategies have proven most effective in bringing about an expansion of LGBTQI plus rights and human rights more broadly? I'd like to start with Vijay.
Well, as I said, we are still in the beginning. What has been successful over the years, I would say there was a lot of ground level work by the activists, lawyers who have done it before us, and that has helped us. And there was no fear even when it was a criminal act, when people were talking about it. And I think that is what needs to be done when we are further asking for the rights that continue to demand, and at various levels, and maybe at some level work with the government also. There is also there's some things which came in the judgment itself, that the judgment itself should be made popularized, or people should be made aware about the judgment everywhere at all levels through government channels, which has not happened in last 3 years. And that is something which will help, because as I keep saying, that this is still, people look at it as an urban centric issue, and the information reaches the urban people, but it doesn't reach the rural people beyond metro cities. And invariably what happens is, the community, the sexual minority community people also, then if they are coming from smaller towns, they want to leave those towns and come to metro cities and make their lives, because obviously they feel they are safer here, or they have better lives. So in that sense, there has to be larger acceptance, and for that acceptance, there has to be this advocacy work has to increase. At the same level, I feel also in terms of laws, one is anti-discrimination law, but more and more judgments have to come in terms of protection. It should not, it's very difficult for every time there is an atrocity or somebody has been kept in confinement to reach a constitutional court, because we can't reach any other court, and these powers are given only to constitutional courts of habeas corpus. So that has to change. And I don't know, I can't think of anything right now how that is going to change, and how the constitutional court is going to allow the lower courts or the trial courts to use that power and help the community. But that has to change, because as I said, many people may not be able to reach the constitutional courts in time. So as I said, all these methods, all these techniques that have been used to reach so far till 2018 and the judgment will have to be repeated again, and with some new techniques.
Thank you, Vijay. Over to you, Cristobal. What legal advocacy strategies have proven most effective in bringing about an expansion of LGBTQI plus rights and human rights more broadly?
Looking at Spain, and when we think about how our legal framework and society changed so fast, not even in 10 years in promoting LGBT rights, I would like to highlight 3 aspects that, in my opinion, were turning points at that moment. The first one is the strengthening of associative movements. Nothing of this legal change would have happened so fast without legal LGBT activists. Second, the ownership of the public space. In Spain, as in India, we do everything at the streets. being visible at the street made us also visible in society and in our families. And when you have a member of the LGBT community in your inner circle, your narrative changes more easily. And third, the commitment of the established powers, such as court, parliament, or government. In the case of Spain, the landmark of our the forefront of our rights could not be achieved without the commitment of the government of Spain in that very moment in 2005. And if we look worldwide, and I'm going to show you, I promise, the last map here. But I think, and when we talk about pioneers in same-sex marriage, there are many regional differences. And what I believe is when a pioneer country enacts an LGBT legal milestone, the like-minded neighbors will face the same social and legal debate, and they might follow up with the same pieces of legislation. We have seen this in Europe, in North and South America, in the case of sex and marriage and other legal LGBT topics. And we need those pioneers in other regions such as Asia or Africa. The LGBT struggle benefits a lot from countries that are at the front of this legal advancement. But we also require those pioneers in our societies. And we need specific public policies to promote that the LGBT community gains its place institutionally. We need counter-majoritarian institutions with, for example, LGBT judges like Judge Victoria here, or as Vijay said, with the first LGBT judge in the Delhi High Court. And these landmark achievements in institutions must come together with regulations that promotes changes also in the private sector. The legal promotion of best practices on top company or the LGBT awareness in TV or cinema are key to consolidate this change. And thank you, Corey.
Thank you very much, Cristobal. Excellent visuals. And I definitely think it's worth highlighting that movements and policy ideas don't have borders, and it's almost a dialectic relationship between and across countries. And finally, but certainly not least, I would like to pass it over to Judge Kolakowski. What do you think are the best or most effective legal advocacy strategies to expand LGBTQI+ rights?
Well, I'll tell you the examples that I have seen in the United States, and that were things that were successful and things that were not. And it makes a lot of sense if you look in terms of the history and the timeline that we've been discussing, which is, first you decriminalize, then you try to seek overt violence against. Then we would move on to other general discrimination. That has been a more successful timeline in the United States. It's very hard to, as long as there's criminalization, it's hard to make any progress at all, because after all, you're talking about people who are engaged in illicit activity, and it's hard to make even social progress when everybody is afraid that they're considered to be immoral and illegal. One of the things that, for example, here in the state of California, I had been involved in trying to work on early transgender rights matters in the 1990s, and we had a bill that was introduced into the legislature that would have provided full protection for transgender people. And I was present at the hearings and testified at a hearing in which every Democrat on the committee got up and walked out when our bill came up, and then it came back afterwards, and it lost because on a 0-3 vote, and the chair abstained. And so we circled around back and said, what are we going to do about this? And we decided to go forward with promoting a hate crimes protection bill, and that was successful because even conservatives felt that was acceptable, and we had a very law and order Republican running for governor who said shocked everyone by coming out in support of it, saying that he always supported penalty enhancements, and so for crimes. And so when we got that through the legislature and got that adopted, we then were able to use that as to build upon. We had all these other bills that came through, and they just pointed to those provisions and just said, as defined in here. And so it was a beachhead, and from there it was able to grow on. And so until eventually we got fully included, but this took time. And one of the things that's very hard when we talk about expanding rights, and this is why I'm a little bit hesitant about even talking this way, is when you're in an environment where people are actually facing things that impact their day-to-day life now, saying we've got a 10-year strategy to try to get this resolved, that doesn't necessarily feel good to people who are sitting there saying, I can't get a job now, I can't find housing now, and so and this is the painful part of it. How do you balance this? Do you go for everything? Do you go for a part and hope to get more? That we've tried both strategies in the United States. I think that going for all of it hasn't worked here, but nevertheless, it's kind of hard to tell people, well, we're going to leave these people behind, and we're going to move forward on the stuff we can do, and we'll come back later and take care of these other things. That's not that's not a very palatable kind of argument, but I do think that sometimes it works. And I mean, I'm really reluctant to say that because especially since those of us who were, I think, more timid, I don't want to say conservative, but more cautious in our approach back in the 1990s, would have been were stunned by, for example, how quickly marriage turned around. And so where we fought for years and years and years for decriminalization, things like that, and all of a sudden we went in the course of a few years from domestic partnerships being considered to be a radical thing to it being what the conservatives were saying, we just have that instead? Rather than full marriage, can't we do that? Civil unions. Why don't we have civil unions? When civil unions were first proposed, it was considered to be this radical thing. And then a few years later, we have conservatives saying civil unions should be just fine. And so we never anticipated this. And I think that this is part of that discussion that I had earlier about how the society changed faster than the legal system did in this particular case. And so, again, the word dialectic, I mean, there's a relationship between the culture and the laws. You need to have, sometimes the laws are, and I agree with what Vijay said about what to move things forward, and sometimes if we can move the society forward faster, they'll drag the courts and the legal system along with it. And so that's my answer to that question.
Excellent. Thank you very much to all the panelists for sharing your candid views on a topic that deserves much more attention. We will now open the floor to questions from the audience. To audience members, please post your questions in the Q&A box below. I see one question from Snigdha Chandra from Delhi. What would be the impact of having separate legislation for the LGBTQI plus community to recognize their rights in personam in India? To clarify, in personam is Latin for against a particular person.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. From Snigdha Chandra in Delhi, what would be the impact of having separate legislation for the LGBTQI plus community to recognize their rights in personam in India, meaning against a particular person?
I'm not getting it exactly. So unless somebody wants to take it.
Maybe
I don't have a.
She can develop in the Q&A box. What is she specifically asking? That will be very useful.
In the meantime, maybe we can move on to another question. And yes. So we'll wait for Snigdha to expand that question and maybe clarify. In the meantime, we can move on to another question from Jaya Sridhar. To all panelists, what kind of stories do the media need to tell to promote inclusive policies and laws for the LGBTQI plus community? Have journalists been scratching the surface of it all? What are they missing?
They are not missing the drama, because I see a lot of drama in the LGBT plus stories in the media, and there are also very successful LGBT families, very successful LGBT entrepreneurs that should be also role models.
I really agree with that. I think that, and that actually ties in. There's a couple of questions that are asked in different ways, approach that I think are kind of related in some ways to this, which is how are we presented to the public and how are we being perceived? One of the reasons that I sought to be a judge was because I wanted people to see that people like me could be in a position like this, because of the fact that what they always see is a portrayal of people who are that when people come into the legal system who are transgender, they're either victims or they're sex workers, and that this is how we're perceived, as being marginal in society and being victims and tragic figures. And so I think that it's important to relate the story of people who are successful. I saw that there was a question about, about begging and how to. This is one of those questions that we always have in terms of our community is how do we present ourselves so that we are not dismissive of or pushing off part of our community that is either important or in some ways marginalized, but not have that be the stereotype that we can have, that we don't, do we need to say that drag queens should not be seen, or do we, but how do we convey to the world that we're not all drag queens, and things like that. And so this is I think a big challenge, and that's part of I think the way that the media can be helpful is by showing portraits of people who are not what you would, are not stereotypical, and people who are successful, people who are maybe even boring, normal and flamboyant, may be more attractive and may sell stories more. But I think that if you want to look in terms of how to make a change for people to see, that, for example, Apple is run by a gay man, a corporation is run by a gay man. This is something that, and he's not, you wouldn't know if he didn't say something about it. And so profiles of people who are members of our community who are well known, or maybe people who are well known in India, for example, giving them more positive coverage, so that it doesn't become just so that people don't have misunderstandings. but also, but one of the things that's hard for us is we don't want to say, you know, that the people who always get the more flamboyant, more visible people don't belong in our community. They do. That I don't want to target sex workers and say, you know, we'll make sex work, we'll improve the how people view of transgender people if we just eliminated sex workers. No, the problem that we have is the fact that we don't have economic opportunities for and employment for transgender people so that they can get jobs. And that's why people are marginalized and living on the street, why they're begging, why they're having to sell their bodies. And this is one of the things I always make a big push when I always have to make a push whenever I speak about we need to employ transgender people. But employment is an important part of this as well. And I saw that one of the questions was about that. We need to be working on ensuring employment, housing, and medical care for our people.
Yeah, just to quickly to add to what both the panelists have said. Yes, stereotyping has to stop, but as the judge said, we can't disown these people who are being stereotyped. They are part of the community also. But also more and more common man stories coming out in the Indian media. There are very few common man stories we can see, but there are no stories of any industrialist, any politician, any judge, any lawyer, any doctor coming out. We know there are several of them. Whether they want to come out or not, that is a question. But what is being portrayed and most of the time is these TV celebrities or actors, and there are these gossip columns which people gossip about their sexuality. But this thing about the common people is not coming out. I had a very interesting conversation with people from ACLU when I was visiting as part of the visitors program actually in San Francisco, and I had read some things, and there were a lot of LGBT cases that were fought by the San Francisco ACLU, and I asked them how did you all change the judges? What made them give all these judgments which come from mostly from California and this thing? So one of the persons there said most of the lawyers who fought them, the cases were also themselves gay. And many times in conversations with judges or the judiciary, at some point they would say, this is my life. This is I am who I am. I'm fighting for a case, but this is what my case, my life is. And you have to understand the judge. And that is what actually changed the judges, changed the mindset, and several judgments which came out protecting the LGBT community there. I think something here needs to be done like that, where you project a lot of common people are. It is not something a completely elite phenomenon, as they say, or something completely, as the judge said, people have no jobs, but they are either begging or sex work. So there are no common or middle level people at all in this community. So that is the perceptions have to change through the media for this.
And the media certainly plays a role in shaping public opinion. Not too long ago, we had elections in the U.S. and we had an openly gay presidential candidate who got more support than a lot of people expected. So I think, and maybe the fact that the media did not cover that extensively speaks loudly to maybe where the majority of the population has shifted in their opinions. Perhaps when the media covers news, it's not necessarily a good thing, but it can go both ways. We have another question from the audience. Nilakshi Roy of Swikar Rainbow Parents, an organization, a parent support group. To anyone who wants to answer, how important is political will as a driving force for making LGBTQI+ friendly laws? Or is change driven by the judiciary and an independent judicial system? Whoever wants to take that question.
In the case of Spain, political will and political commitment was key in the advancement of LGBT rights, and more important, within those political parties, the legal activism and the parliamentarian activism of LGBT members of those political parties were key, because they raised their voices to put that legal and constitutional debate on the table in the parliament. So of course it is. I mean, it depends of in the legal systems and how different countries has its constitutional power established. But in the case of Spain, political will and political commitment was key, and that's the reason that also in politics we need more LGBT parliamentarians, more LGBT members of political parties.
Well, according to me, it is extremely important, because you can't drive, as I said, only through the judiciary. A lot of judges are finally approved by the government, and it can't be only through the judiciary. And there is a change in terms of India. There are a lot of parties now opening LGBTQI plus cells in the parties. And some of the parties, I remember in the last election, had in their manifestos some things in terms of rights of LGBT community. So it's extremely important. There is a change, but I feel it's an extremely slow change that we are seeing, because though these cells are there and they say the things in the manifestos, but the main politicians who are part of the party will not talk about it in the election rallies or in the meetings. So it remains a one-off event when the cell is inaugurated, and then I don't know what happens, what further things happen with those cells. But I think the political will is extremely important.
Kolakowski, do you think that political will is it as a driving force for LGBTQI plus friendly laws should necessarily be the way forward? One example is when a parliamentarian or a congressional representative, raises the conversation to the national level, and that can have an amplifying power.
I think that it is one approach, one part of a variety of things, just as we were talking about with regard to the culture. I think that it helps very, very much, actually, to have visible people who are in leadership, who are active and involved, and for the reason that, as was described earlier, with regard to having attorneys who are LGBT appearing in court, and the way that and judges seeing that, I think that electing LGBT people to office, for example, it's a lot harder for people to be hostile towards their colleagues when they're looking them in the face. Not that doesn't happen. Some people are really good at that no matter what. But I think that it can often lead to movement forward, to have somebody in the room that people are associated with. Just as I said earlier about people coming out to their friends and families, I think it's important to have people who are colleagues who are like us, because I think it changes the way that they perceive it as well. In addition, I think that it's important to have people who can be articulating these positions on a larger scale. And with regard to media presentation, it's easier to get, I mean, if you wanted to have, if you were going to, for example, have a conversation on a television show where we're talking about a topic or something like this, having a person who is in government or a leader those are the sort of people that they want to have, to be on to discuss these issues. They want comments from people like that, and so we need to have people in these kind of positions in academia in government who can help be part of the greater public discussion, as well as, you know, I think religious leaders as well. I mean, supportive religious leaders are important. Various different, there are different aspects of society, and I think that we need to have, that if you want to be successful, there needs to be movement in trying to support all of them. And it's kind of hard sometimes to see which is more important, because it seems to me that when things are successful is when each of these is a part of the process, where we have and where one, it's not like we just come in and say we have somebody comes in and we pass a law and it's like great and you know, everything's perfect and it's solved. That doesn't happen. I think there was something in the questions about that. I've talked to people in other countries who've told me we have great laws here, but nobody enforces them, so it doesn't really matter. And so, but on the other hand, we need to have, we need the laws. And so, again, I think that it's kind of hard to pull one piece of this out and just look at it and say, this is the solution. The truth is that we need to make progress societally, and that the law and the courts can be a part of that, but some people look to the courts as being, the court will do something and then it'll make a decision and then everything is better, and that's not the case. It's part of our process of moving forward as a society. I don't know that I answered the question, but I did talk a lot.
I think you did a great job answering the question. And I think you bring up a relevant point, that it's a process, right? Very much like democracy. There's no golden standard, and nothing should be taken for granted. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. This has been an extremely insightful and eye-opening discussion. And I wanted to take a second to say thank you to the panelists, to Judge Kolakowski, to Cristobal, and to Vijay for joining us tonight, to Consul General David Rands, to the Meridian International Center, and to my public affairs colleagues at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, and especially at the U.S. Consulate General in Mumbai. Good night and good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Cody.
Thanks for inviting me.